I'm Marisa Hughes. I'm chair of the Wildlife Committee at Lake Monticello, and we are here on Saturday, October 11th, to celebrate the community-wide certification in the National Wildlife Federation's Community Wildlife Habitat Program. We were able to do this through work by the whole committee, all of the entire community. We needed to get 150 points for various things: education, outreach, program management, as well as 150 residents on board with certified yards certified as wildlife habitats. The work for this began in 2020. Primarily was done by all of the Wildlife Committee members before me and the work of all the residents that took place in the last 5 years. So I'm just here to be part of the celebration. We have Larry here to say a few words. The National Wildlife Federation has sent a letter of congratulations. We are the 11th certified community in the state of Virginia and the only one in Central Virginia. So take it away, Larry.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you all for coming out. This is, I'm sure, for the Wildlife Committee, a big day since you started this process in 2020. I thought the board of directors moved slow, but anyhow, congratulations on finally getting it. What I'm looking at here on my phone is a letter from the National Wildlife Federation to Lake Monticello. So I'd like to read this to you. To Lake Monticello, on behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, we are pleased to congratulate you on completing the requirements for certification as the nation's 176th community wildlife habitat. You have joined a distinguished list of communities that have chosen to make creating wildlife habitat and sustainable gardening practices an important priority. In 2020, you registered in the Community Wildlife Habitat Program with a goal to protect wildlife species that call Lake Monticello home and engage residents through education and outreach projects. Since your registration, oh Lord, hang with me. Since your registration, you have undertaken several wildlife protection efforts, including applying for and receiving funding to replant trees throughout our community golf course, encouraging residents to plant native by collaborating with your board to remove invasive species from recommended plant list. You also work to engage residents of all ages in these efforts by publishing various educational brochures that are all around here, hosting programming on different topics related to wildlife protection, organizing a butterfly garden tour, and distributing native plant lists at community events. And this is just a small snapshot of what these folks do, the great work they do. Lake Monticello certification would not be possible without the hard work of your community wildlife habitat team, the wildlife committee, as well as countless volunteers and local partners who help the community create and maintain wildlife habitat through this project. The National Wildlife Federation is proud to have Lake Monticello as one of its newest certified community wildlife habitats, representing our program's mission to create healthy, sustainable, and wildlife-friendly communities. Congratulations on the job well done, and we look forward to seeing all that you accomplish next. Sincerely, the Community Wildlife Habitat Team.
Hello, my name is Allison and I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Wildlife Center of Virginia. I'm really excited to be here today to help you guys celebrate a really fantastic milestone. I heard that you all are recently certified as a wildlife habitat, the whole neighborhood, so congratulations on that. That is definitely no small feat. Thank you for being here. Thank you. And so kind of along that theme, I'm going to talk to you guys today about common human-wildlife conflicts and tips for avoiding them entirely or just ways to deal with them when they do occur. And I'm going to try to focus a little bit on white-tailed deer in particular, since I was told there are lots and lots of deer in the neighborhood. So hopefully you all get a little information out of this that can help you with any wildlife conflicts that you have moving forward. That said, I will say countless times throughout the presentation, if you do ever have a very specific situation or want more specific advice, or obviously if you come across an animal that you think is in trouble in any sort of way, please always feel free to contact the Wildlife Center of Virginia, but I'll give you a little more information on that as we move on. And there will also be time for questions at the end, so if you do have questions, please hold on to them. Just starting off with a little bit of information on what the Wildlife Center is. It sounds like you all as a neighborhood are relatively familiar with us. If you aren't super familiar, we are essentially a wildlife hospital, and we're located over in Waynesboro. So we're about 45 minutes or so from here. So in the grand scheme of things, not too far. But we were founded in 1982. One of our founders, Ed Clark, you've probably heard his name before. He's a very popular guy, and he really just wanted to fill a gap. There was essentially just a lack of resources at the time for wild animals needing veterinary care. And so he wanted to create a specific place for these wild animals to go to if they were in need of help, and sometimes even needing long-term extended care. And so that's what caused him to found the Wildlife Center. And we actually started over in Wares Cave, so a little farther than Waynesboro, in a horse barn. And the stalls were the patient enclosures. And at that time, a busy year was maybe about 20 patients for the whole year. And fast forward to 2024, just last year, we treated over 4,600 animals. So that's just to say our caseload each year has picked up quite a bit. This year we're expecting to treat probably closer to about 5,000 animals. And in our over 40-year history, we've treated over 100,000 animals total. So we are definitely quite busy pretty constantly, but thankfully we do have a wonderful team of veterinarians, vet techs, wildlife rehabilitators that all work really, really hard to help these animals recover and get better in whatever way they need to. And then our goal is always to get them back out into the wild and get them back home whenever we can. So for that reason, we call ourselves a treat to release hospital, because we're treating them to release them. And we are also a nonprofit organization. That is a big thing to keep in mind as well. So that essentially means we are not your tax dollars at work by any means. We actually get all of our funding from generous donors. So actually people just like you guys who essentially believe in our cause and want to help support our mission of teaching the world to care about and care for wildlife and the environment. But I also like to point out that there are a lot of ways to support us that aren't just giving us your money, because we definitely rely on volunteers pretty heavily at the Wildlife Center, and we also take donations of supplies and food as well. So if you don't have a whole lot of money to give, but maybe you have some old sheets and blankets that you can hand out, then we can take things like that as well. So there are lots of ways to support the work we do. And so this is just to kind of highlight that we are a veterinary hospital, and we also work very heavily on wildlife rehabilitation. And so we are a little bit unique compared to a lot of wildlife rehabilitation services in the state of Virginia, because most rehabilitators actually work out of their homes, and that's just kind of like their side passion hobby that they do, that they also don't get paid for that. It's all out of pocket, but we thankfully have a state-of-the-art veterinary hospital at our disposal. So that makes things a little easier in terms of if a patient, needs some antibiotics, or if a patient has a broken bone of some kind, then we have dedicated veterinarians and a whole veterinary team that can actually treat that animal. But we will also take healthy, young, basically orphaned animals as well. So it is a good mix of a lot of those things. So lots of veterinary care for injured and sick animals, but also lots of just basic rehabilitation for those orphaned animals that just need to grow up a little bit and then can get back to the wild. And another big thing to note is that we're also a teaching hospital. So not only are we taking in these wild patients, helping them recover, getting them back out into the wild, but we also are really passionate about teaching the next generation about wildlife rehabilitation and wildlife medicine. And so we invite students from all over the world to come and work alongside our staff. They're very trained, very knowledgeable, and basically get that hands-on experience with wild animals. And as you can probably imagine, that's fairly difficult to come by, even for somebody that's maybe in veterinary school. A lot of veterinary students are mostly getting hands-on experience with domestic animals. And while there are lots of similarities with domestic veterinary medicine and wildlife veterinary medicine, there are lots of differences and nuances as well. So that's really valuable. But whether it's veterinary students, veterinary technician students, or just undergraduate students that may be studying a relevant field like biology, we invite all of them to come in and learn as much as they want to from our staff members. So that kind of goes along with our mission of teaching the world. And on a similar note of teaching the world, we also have a very extensive outreach and education department and program, and that is what I'm a part of as our outreach coordinator. And so basically it is not enough to just treat these animals, teach students in the next generation. We want to, like in our mission statement, teach the world as much as we can. So this includes teaching members of the public and actually going out and doing presentations like this, or taking some of our animal ambassadors off-site to schools and libraries and festivals, and having people come for private tours of the center sometimes. And this is all so we can essentially tell the stories of our patients and explain a lot of the common issues that we see in our hospital, since we do have a relatively unique perspective as a wildlife hospital. So we're able to explain things that we see that a lot of people just simply aren't aware of, and bring some awareness to it, of course, and also just help encourage people to coexist with wildlife. And also, if nothing else, just let people know that we are here and that we are a resource. Before I start focusing too much on the common human-wildlife conflicts that we hear about at our wildlife hospital, I wanted to touch on just white-tailed deer as a whole. So that way, when we are talking about those issues, we can better understand the essentially history of white-tailed deer, just some biological understanding of why they may do certain things, as well as kind of going over some state laws regarding white-tailed deer, because they are, if nothing else in the rehabilitation side of things, a little bit of a funky species. I wanted to start out by just making very clear that no rehabilitator in the state of Virginia is actually allowed to treat adult white-tailed deer. They are not eligible for rehabilitation. And this is essentially for safety for both the animal as well as the people involved in trying to care for that animal. White-tailed deer, as a prey species, they are quite susceptible to something called capture myopathy, which is basically when the animal gets so severely stressed that their bodies just shut down and they pass away from fear. And it is really difficult to avoid, especially with adult animals that already have that very established and strong fear of humans, like they should for survival in the wild. But it makes working with adult deer pretty tricky, because if you're working with a very incredibly stressed animal, it's probably going to try and defend itself. Deer are ones that they typically try to either freeze or run away, and if they can't do either of those things, they may start kicking. Lots of just really troublesome things. And if a human gets kicked by a deer, they have pretty strong hooves and it's going to hurt and cause some damage. And so if nothing else, over the years, rehabilitators have found that trying to rehabilitate adult deer just simply doesn't work because of how stressed they get in care, especially if they're injured, which is typically why an adult deer would need to come into care, but also it creates those safety concerns for humans as well. So adult deer are one of the species that the state says rehabilitators cannot work with for some reason. Adult deer, they are at least native, but it's those safety risks that make us not allowed to work with them. But you can see some of the other species that we aren't allowed to work with as well. And mostly those are because they are either considered nuisance species or they are actually invasive and non-native. So they are actually disrupting the food sources and ecological balance of all the rest of the native wildlife that we have here in Virginia. And so this is also why assessment of whether an animal truly needs medical care is incredibly important if you're going to take an animal to a rehabilitator, because these species in particular, the only thing rehabilitators are allowed to do is either give them back and say, put it back where you found it, or provide humane euthanasia if that animal is suffering. So you can't take any of these animals to a rehabilitator unless that animal truly needs assistance. Just to give a little bit of detail on fawns, most rehabilitators can work with relatively healthy fawns. And when I say fawns, I'm talking about the young deer that still have those white spots on them. So if a deer looks young, but it doesn't have the white spots, that is unfortunately not considered a fawn. It is a juvenile or adult at that point. But fawns are typically going to be born between April and July, and the mothers leave their young in a very specific spot that they deem as safe for up to 12 hours at a time. So actually during those months of April and July, we get so many calls from members of the public that find a fawn laying on its own, just staying in one place because they think that it's orphaned, that it needs help. And what we end up having to explain to people a lot of the time is that this is very natural for that animal, for that species. And so this is all to say, if you see a fawn that is just sitting in place, it's quiet, it looks, kind of like one of these fawns in the picture, nothing is obviously wrong with it. It's not crying, it's not wet and cold, nothing like that, then it is very likely a healthy fawn that was intentionally left there by its mother. And you can monitor the deer and see if the mother comes back, and if the fawn is still in that same location 24 hours later, then we can start having discussions on, okay, is this an orphaned fawn? Does it need help? That sort of thing. Common questions that we ask people when they express concerns about fawns include things like, okay, where is the fawn located? Is it in the middle of the road? Because that just obviously isn't helpful for anybody. But also, is it in a backyard, maybe with a bunch of dogs in there that the fawn could get attacked? If it's not in a dangerous location, then we move on to how long has the fawn been there? If it's been less than 12 hours, we are most likely going to tell you to wait unless it is showing any of these other signs that I have listed here, including, does the fawn have any feces or diarrhea buildup on its hind end? Does it have fly strike or fly eggs anywhere on it? They kind of look like little grains of rice. Does the coat look very clearly poorly maintained? Does this deer just look really rough? And like I mentioned before, we'll also ask if it is crying, if it's running around frantically. But if it is sitting quietly in place and doesn't have those concerning signs, then it is very likely a healthy fawn that is just waiting for its mom to come back. And also, to explain why mother deer do this, it is essentially so they don't attract predators to their babies. And fawns don't have quite as strong of a scent on them as the mother deer do, and so they have to kind of basically not be with them as much as possible to prevent predators from smelling them and then not only getting the mom, but getting the babies as well. So it is quite strategic, very intentional, and very important for their survival. Some common reasons that we will admit white-tailed deer into our hospital, or if nothing else, we receive calls about white-tailed deer, include things like getting hit by cars, which is a whole subject I will delve into in a second, as well as getting tangled up or trapped in certain materials or spaces. But really the biggest one that we actually have white-tailed deer fawns in care for is that they are true orphans, that something happened to the mothers and they are out there on their own and they need to be raised until they're independent. And so just to reiterate, if you see a fawn, don't assume that it is orphaned. If you ever have any questions or doubts about that, please always give us a call. That is exactly what we're there for, and we are more than happy to help you figure out if this fawn truly needs care or not. But please always call us if you're not sure. And so another limitation that makes working with white-tailed deer a little tricky in the state of Virginia is a disease called chronic wasting disease that some of you may have heard of before, but it's essentially a very, very nasty neurological disease that can affect deer as well as elk and moose. And it is typically spread through basically just bodily fluids. So things like saliva and feces and urine, just all the nasty stuff that we try not to touch anyway. But this disease, it's only present in certain counties in Virginia right now, and the State Department would absolutely love if we try and prevent or slow that disease spread as much as possible. And currently it's mostly in Northern Virginia as well as Southwest Virginia. So where we are in Waynesboro, it hasn't quite hit that county yet. It hasn't hit Augusta County. It hasn't hit any immediately surrounding counties. And we would very much like to keep it that way if possible. Basically what this means is we're trying to limit that disease spread. And so the state wildlife department says that no deer, whether they are adults, whether they are healthy fawns that are orphaned, doesn't matter. Any deer that are found in these counties, they are not eligible for rehabilitation. And while this can be pretty upsetting to a lot of people that do come across an animal that really needs help, it is absolutely crucial for these deer to not be going across county lines, because then that runs a risk of further spreading that disease. And we honestly don't have too much information on how bad this disease is, if it could be a risk to humans, but the current recommendation right now is if you hunt a deer and it has chronic wasting disease, you basically are going to look at the lymph nodes, and there are some signs on the lymph nodes that will tell you if it has it or not. And if it is determined that that deer has chronic wasting disease, it's generally advised not to even consume the meat of that deer, because we don't know too much about it. We don't know if it can harm humans. So if you do ever come across a deer that is suffering, just something is wrong, then you're going to actually need to call your local sheriff's office or animal control, or you can also call the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources helpline at this listed number. You're welcome to take a picture or jot that down if you want to, but that is because we legally aren't really allowed to do anything, unfortunately. But similarly, we can provide as much advice as possible. We just cannot take those deer into care. Now that we've established those things, we can move on to some common conflicts that we hear about, especially at our front desk at the Wildlife Center. So I'll share some of those conflicts and also share some tips for how to handle them when they are currently happening, as well as hopefully avoid them entirely in the future. So the big one that I've already mentioned a little bit is vehicle collisions. And you guys are probably already familiar with the fact that white-tailed deer are actually the most frequently hit wild animal in the state of Virginia. And the state of Virginia in general has a pretty high rate of wildlife vehicle collisions, essentially. And so if nothing else, that kind of shows that there is a need for more wildlife crossings. But typically those deer-car collisions are going to happen mostly in November. November has the statistically highest rate of these collisions, but they also happen really frequently in October and December as well. So basically those last 3 months of the year. And that is really because that's when deer are going to be a lot more active. There's a couple of things going on here. One, deer that were born this year, basically that spring, they're going to be kind of newly independent during these months. And so essentially they're a little young and dumb, that they don't quite understand how the world works yet. They don't understand that multi-ton vehicles hurtling towards them are possibly dangerous, because once again, deer sort of instinctively freeze a lot of the time. But also this is breeding season for white-tailed deer. And so they're going to be more active in general because they're looking for mates as well. And so really it's also going to be that they are crepuscular, which means that they're most active at dawn and dusk. And so really what this means for us as humans is that deer are more likely to be trying to cross roads during essentially rush hour, which is a really unfortunate coincidence, but basically between 5 and 8 o'clock in the morning as well as at night, that is when there are the statistically most deer and car vehicle collisions. And so really during those times you want to be extra careful, especially because it's getting dark or the sun is just coming up at those times, and so you need to be extra vigilant when you're driving during those times, during these months in particular. But even though it is a huge issue for white-tailed deer, it's also something that we see patients in our hospital for constantly. We get hundreds of patients every single year that have been hit by cars, and they're ranging from little box turtles, they're just trying to cross the road and they can't walk very fast, and sometimes people don't see them, but it can also be larger animals like birds of prey, and in those cases they're not just trying to cross, they're actually going towards a food source that is in the road, which I'll touch on in just a second. Some general advice on what to do if you do hit a wild animal. For white-tailed deer in particular, you're going to want to pull over if you can, turn on your hazards, of course, and also shine your essentially headlights on the animal, especially if it is still in the middle of the road, so that way not only you but other people can see that animal as well. And you'll definitely want to check yourself and any passengers for any injuries, and even if there aren't any clear injuries, just keep in mind that shock can set in pretty quickly, and so especially if it's cold, make sure you put on a jacket, use a blanket, anything you have at your disposal, because shock and fear can make it a little harder to ward off the cold in a lot of cases. And in general, you will also want to call 911 even if there aren't super clear injuries or damage to your car or anything, because we really do not advise members of the public to try and move animals out of the road themselves. So even if you aren't injured, you need somebody else to come out and take care of this animal, because that is a danger to you. Definitely want to call 911, and once again, don't try to take that animal out of the road by yourself. Remember what I said before, that deer, when they are in distress, when they are scared and injured, even if they look really dull and, like they're kind of on their way out, they may use the last of their energy reserves to try and kick at you because they're scared of you. And so just don't go near the animal. And once again, if it's in the road, keep your car stationary, shine some light on the animal, and wait until help arrives. The advice is going to be really, really similar for black bears as well, but the only extra step that you'll want to take for black bears is you're going to want to call the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources Conservation Police dispatch number. And this is because black bears are pretty heavily monitored and managed by the State Department. And so they're, if nothing else, gonna wanna know that a black bear was hit by a car, and that's one less bear in the population, where it happened, what the situation was. But then they may also be able to provide some assistance in actually moving the bear out of the road as well. So really the biggest thing here is make sure that you're staying safe if that ever happens. And if you haven't yet hit a deer, but you're about to, we do generally advise people to slow down, hit your brakes as much as you can, but then at the last second before you actually hit the deer, take your foot off the brakes, because this will allow the front of your car to lift up just a little bit, and it provides a slightly higher likelihood that the deer will go under your car rather than over and onto the hood or through your windshield or something like that. And I'm not going to try and say that that works every single time, but it is a strategy that you can try to essentially prevent as much damage from occurring as possible. But, it's always great to just try and not hit them in the first place, which I will talk about as well. So for other animals that aren't deer and aren't black bears, there are some species that we refer to as RVS, which means rabies vector species. And there are 5 species that we have in Virginia that sort of fall into that category, that are going to be woodchucks or groundhogs. They're the same thing, as well as skunks and raccoons, foxes, and bats. Those are really the top 5. That said, if you hit an animal of this species, or just see them in general, don't assume they have rabies. There's probably a 1% chance that they actually do, but just keep that in mind. So if you do hit one of those animals, refrain from touching it, especially barehanded if you can. Barehanded contact with these rabies vector species or adult mammals in general can be a risk, especially in the view of the health department. If we do ever get an animal that somebody has touched with their bare hands, or if the animal licked or bit somebody, then we do have to tell the health department, and legally they will want to do some rabies testing to make sure that you are not at risk. And unfortunately, rabies can only be tested on brain tissue of the affected animal, which requires humane euthanasia. If an animal needs rabies testing, they have to die. And there's really no way around that. So One, to make sure that the animal can get the best help possible, but also to protect yourself. You never want to touch those animals barehanded. Always have some sort of barrier if you can. And if that is not something you're comfortable handling on your own, don't. Call your sheriff's department, your animal control, or you can even call us for some advice on how to best kind of contain that animal if appropriate. And for really any other animal, it's going to be the same thing where if you're comfortable containing it, you are welcome to do so and get it to us or another wildlife rehabilitator. Just make sure that you're using a secure, well-ventilated container as well. If you can't transport it to appropriate care immediately, then definitely keep it in a dark, quiet, relatively warm place. Don't have your kids or your pets looking at it, anything like that. But you always want to get that animal into care as soon as possible. But once again, if you are not comfortable containing an animal, absolutely do not do anything that you are not comfortable doing. And similarly, you can call us. That is what we're here for. And we might be able to send out a volunteer of ours that is possibly comfortable containing that animal. So it's always good to call us just in case. So ways that we can just avoid these vehicle collisions from happening in the first place are going to be things like scanning the sides of the road as well as the road itself, especially as it's starting to get dark. Use your high beams whenever you can, unless a car is actively driving towards you. You don't want to blind anybody. Pay attention to those highway signs, for little signs that say deer crossing or black bear crossing. Those signs are there for a reason. And it's because historically there has been a higher number of vehicle collisions relating to those animals in those areas. So that is basically telling you, hey, there are animals of this species here. You need to be extra careful and watch out for them in this particular spot. Always pay attention to those highway signs. And if you do see an animal either in the road or kind of off to the side of the road, slow down. Don't hit your brakes super hard and cause a different kind of accident, but slow down a little bit. And you can even honk your horn to try and encourage that animal to get away from the road, as well as to warn other cars nearby that, hey, there's an animal here, watch out a little bit. A really fantastic prevention is to not litter. This is what we call the message of the apple core at the Wildlife Center. Essentially, a lot of people think that they're actually doing a good thing when they're snacking on an apple or a banana or something like that, and they throw out the core or banana peel either into the road or even, as far into the woods off to the side of the road as they can, because they think, yeah, I'm giving some wild animals a food source and it's biodegradable, so it'll break down on its own, and they think that they're doing a really helpful thing. But the reality is that you are placing a food source in or near the road, and that is going to attract wild animals that are simply trying to get an easy meal. And then oftentimes, wild mommies and daddies don't tell their kids to look both ways before they cross the road, and so they do end up getting hit by cars, and that's what results in roadkill oftentimes. Sometimes it's animals just trying to get across, but a lot of the time it's animals that are attracted to the road by that food source. And if that's not sad enough to see a squirrel or a skunk or a possum or something like that hit on the side of the road, it can attract larger, more predator sort of animals like birds of prey. We actually admit so many large birds of prey at the Wildlife Center, especially during this time of year, because they were hit by cars. And they were hit by cars very likely because they were trying to get an easy food source, being the roadkill that was in the road. So one way that you can prevent this entire cycle from happening at all is to remember that no litter is safe litter. Always, always, always dispose of your trash responsibly, and that will just prevent this issue from occurring in the first place a lot of the time. Moving on to our next issue, I know some people may have some feelings about this, so I'm going to go ahead and give a very big disclaimer. We at the Wildlife Center do not hate cats, like a lot of people seem to believe when we bring up this issue. We are not against cats. I have a cat at home, and I don't have human children yet, so she's functionally my human child, and I love her to death. She is my entire world, and I would never want anything bad to happen to her. So this is not about us disliking cats. This has nothing to do with it. This is simply about, natural history and biology in a way. And so free roaming cats, basically cats that are allowed outdoors unsupervised, it is a huge problem. And some reasons why it's a huge problem include, basically at its core, domestic cats, they are not native animals to Virginia. So they are this introduced predator. In a way, they're almost like an invasive species, functionally speaking, that they come in and cause a lot of ecological imbalance because they are killing native animals. Those animals haven't adapted over thousands of years to either, get away from these predators or learn to coexist with them. So cats are really just a really big predator in terms of Virginia wildlife and our ecosystem, and it causes that really severe imbalance. And just to give a little bit of a stat, free-roaming cats are estimated to kill a minimum of about 7.6 billion wild animals per year. That's a number that I don't think any of us can really fully fathom. It is so incredibly large, and it really includes so many different wild animals. So there really is that huge impact there that is sort of undeniable regardless of your feelings towards it. But part of the reason why this essentially death toll is so high regarding cats is because cats do have some very aggressive bacteria inside their mouths. And if you've ever been bit by a cat, you might have experienced needing to go to urgent care to get some antibiotics or something, and it's the exact same thing. So even if cats don't immediately kill the animal or consume the animal, if the animal is able to get away, even if they're able to get to a wildlife hospital like ours, they can end up still declining and eventually passing away due to severe bacterial infections. So it's not always those immediate injuries that kills the animals of cat attacks, essentially. Another little stat for you guys, I looked it up before I came here, and just this year alone so far, the Wildlife Center has admitted about 393 patients due to confirmed cat attacks. So that's not including suspected cat attacks. That's ones where the person saw the cat go after the animal. So that number is likely higher in terms of the actual cat attack victims that we've received this year, but that's really just to say it's in the hundreds that we see every single year, and that's why we do talk about this issue, is because it's something that we see constantly. And another little stat is that a study that we conducted a few years ago on our own patient database, we found that there was about a 70 to 80% mortality rate for patients that we received, so animals that were already getting veterinary care, that either needed to be humanely euthanized due to the severity of their injuries on intake, or they passed away later due to bacterial infection. So this is all just to say that cats do have a huge impact on our local ecosystems, and if that isn't enough for you, being allowed outdoors is also a danger to the cat themselves. They can possibly run into vehicles, get hit by cars. They're at a higher exposure for diseases like rabies in particular, and rabies is not something you want to mess with at all. And even just other predators, whether that's a coyote or whether that's maybe just a really not very nice human. There's a lot of things that can happen when cats are allowed outside unsupervised. I've already been a huge Debbie Downer talking about why that's a problem. So what are ways that we can prevent those things and help this particular issue out? And really the biggest answer is to keep your cats indoors. And some people aren't a huge fan of that answer because they say, no, my cat's not going to be happy inside. It's enriching for them to be outside. But what people fail to realize when they make that argument is that there are so many ways to enrich your cat when they're living an indoor-only lifestyle. And so they can still get all of that outdoor stimuli without actually being exposed to the dangers of being outside. So one that I personally love is building a catio, aka a cat patio. So essentially a little screened-in porch for your cats where they can still enjoy being outside, hear all the sounds, kind of listen to the rain, that sort of thing, but they're in an enclosed space and not in any danger. Another thing that some people like to do, I tried this very briefly and my cat wasn't really into it, but harness training and actually taking your cat for little walks outside. That's another really fantastic option where they can still feel the ground underneath their feet and kind of watch all the squirrels climb up the trees, but they can't actually get the squirrel and that sort of thing. So I think that's a really fun option. And if nothing else, if neither of those two things float your boat, then there is always just enrichment and basically making sure that your cat is mentally stimulated in a way that encourages those natural behaviors. So they are natural hunters. They do want to hunt things, or if nothing else, just bat things around. So it can be as simple or as complex as you would like it to be. So it can be playing with your cat using their favorite toy. It can be putting treats in a little paper bag filled with newspaper that they have to dig around and find the treats. There's puzzle feeders, there's lick mats. There are so many options. So, there are lots of ways that you can keep your cat happy and healthy indoors. And not only does that keep your cat safe, but that also is going to keep wildlife in your surrounding area much, much safer as well. So the next one, I don't have too many details to share on this because I think it kind of speaks for itself, but we do see a lot of animals that got tangled up or trapped in different materials and spaces. And so these are going to be things like snakes and other animals getting caught in garden netting or something along those lines. Things like fishing gear that's left out, and that's, lots of aquatic turtles we see ingest or are hooked on those fish hooks. Lots of animals get tangled in fishing line. Nets that are left out, all sorts of things like that. There's also live traps. A lot of people do use live traps to capture animals on their property and then relocate them off their property, which is actually, for one, not legal. But the reason that it is illegal to relocate wildlife off of your property is because most animals don't survive that transition, because it is really difficult to know what an animal's specific home territory is, what they consider to be their home. And so you taking that animal off your property line can be taking them out of their territory, and then they no longer know where to find the resources that they need to survive. So that can actually be life or death for a lot of animals. So try not to use live traps unless you're trying to contain an animal that's injured or sick or needs some sort of help. Or, if it's inside your house, of course, trap it, but then release it on your property. Please don't release animals off of your property entirely. And then also glue traps are a big one that some of you may already be aware of this, that there are some states that are already banning glue traps entirely. And this is because they are very indiscriminate traps that most of the time people are using them to capture mice or bugs or little things like that. But sort of similar to the road, if an animal is in a certain place, that's going to attract other animals that want to eat that animal or that food source. So this picture right here, you can see a bug is stuck on that glue trap, and this little bird here was probably just trying to go after that bug and then also got stuck. So it's really, really difficult to manage which animals are caught on glue traps and which aren't. And so if you're having a situation that is making you want to use a glue trap, basically, contact a pest control company and they will probably have better and frankly more effective solutions than glue traps. But really the biggest animals that are targeted by these sort of things are snakes and turtles and sometimes salamanders and little birds and things like that. So just be mindful of the things that you are leaving outside. And like for landscape netting, for example, or garden netting, you can use different things that aren't those, that are a little safer for animals, things like burlap or newspaper or cardboard that'll still do the same function but helps protect the animals a little bit. Obviously, just making sure you're cleaning up after yourself if you ever go fishing or hunting or anything like that. Basically, leaving or using the mindset of leave no trace is always very good. Since I did kind of touch on snakes, I did want to talk a little bit about snakes in general, because we get a lot of phone calls from people basically upset that a snake is on their property. But essentially, a lot of people get really nervous when they see a snake at all, and especially if there is a snake that kind of frequents their property. It makes people really nervous because snakes are often made out to be the bad guys. A lot of people don't really understand them, and it can be a very tricky situation. So basically, the things I wanted to focus on here are, if you do ever see a snake, how to tell if it's in trouble. And the snake is probably fine unless it's trapped in something or in some place. Unless you see these things, then the snake is fine and you don't need to interact with it. You don't need to do anything. And they're actually really fantastic neighbors to have. It's actually a good thing to have snakes on your property, because it means that those pest populations are going to be much more controlled, because that's exactly the sort of thing that snakes go after. And they're also really fantastic indicators of a healthy ecosystem. So they're very important neighbors to have. And some common reasons that we see them at the Wildlife Center include, things like altercations while lawn work is occurring, or getting caught in things like landscape netting, and as well as glue traps. And I did just want to include this photo because even though it is quite upsetting, I think it does shine a light on how harmful glue traps specifically really tend to be. I want to say this is 9 or possibly 11 snakes on a single glue trap. And this is something that we only saw at the center even just a few years ago. So this is a little more essentially a dramatic example of the issue. It shows that there is no limit to how many animals a glue trap can catch, and it is very indiscriminate. Some tips on coexisting with snakes, as long as the snake is not in your house or anything, it's not like actively causing issues like that. Really, if you want to deter snakes, then you'll want to make sure that you address any rodent infestations in your house. So contact a licensed pest control company. You'll also want to make sure that you keep your grass cut. They do tend to like taller grass, and that'll do a lot to help as well, especially right up against your home. And just removing piles of things near your home as well, or near any structure you're trying to not let them be in, essentially, because they like to hide in piles of things. And avoid using that landscape or garden netting, since they do get caught in it pretty frequently. You can use some of those alternatives. Really, the biggest thing is just to remember that snakes are first cowards, then bluffers, and last of all, warriors. That's essentially saying that snakes are way more afraid of us than we are of them. Even the largest snakes that we have here in Virginia, central rat snakes, they can get to be about 7 feet long, and even those guys will look at a human and know that we are a much scarier predator than they are. We can do so much more damage to a snake than a snake can do to us. So just remember that they are very cowardly. They will try to get away from you. They don't want to have any confrontation. If they do, basically if they're trapped or something like that, then they'll kind of act like they're going to bite you and that they are really scary and, I'm very fierce, get away from me. And then if they're left no other choice, yes, they will bite. They will defend themselves, just like any of us would, just like any other animal with teeth or a mouth in general would. So snakes are not unique in that they can bite, but just give them space and leave them alone. And that's exactly how you can coexist with them. I did just want to note that we do have 3 venomous species of snake here in Virginia, but that is also 3 species out of about 30 species of snake that we have. So that's really just to say, if you see a snake, don't assume that it's venomous. If you want to know, you're welcome to contact us or the Virginia Herpetological Society. If you can take a photo, you can get an ID on that snake, and then you'll just know for your own purposes. Really, the ones that you'll come in contact with most here are going to be copperheads and maybe the occasional rattlesnake, but we don't really have cottonmouths too often up here. Venomous snakes, it's going to be the same thing. Just give them space and leave them alone. They are not inherently more aggressive than other non-venomous snakes, like a lot of people try to argue. That's just simply not the case. So just give them space and leave them alone, and that's all you have to do. Another one is animals building nests in slightly inconvenient locations. We also get calls about this pretty frequently. And really the big thing to keep in mind here is that relocation is not the answer. I've already gone over this a little bit, but you do not want to move those babies or move that nest off of your property, or if you can help it, just move it in general. It is going to put those babies in a little bit of a not so great position. And in the case of birds, it is actually a federal crime to move a bird's nest that has eggs and babies in it, because that is a death sentence for those animals. And most birds are federally protected under the Migratory Bird Act. And so you absolutely cannot move a bird's nest unless you contact the Department of Wildlife Resources, and they may or may not give you explicit permission to move that nest if it's in a really bad location, like your car engine or something, because we understand like those things happen sometimes, but you want to make sure that you actually get the proper permission to do so in those cases. And in a lot of other cases, just try not to move them. Most wild animals, they do disperse and leave the nest within a few weeks, actually. So if you can just be patient and wait for them to leave on their own, then once there aren't any babies in the nest, if there's not babies or eggs, then you can do whatever you want with it. A cottontail nest in the ground in your backyard, you can throw some dirt in it, you can fill it up so that way they don't use it the following year. A bird's nest, you're welcome to destroy it or move it or do whatever you want with it to prevent future use, but you just really, really, really shouldn't do anything if there are actively eggs or babies in those nests. But similarly, if this does ever happen to you and you're like, oh, it's in a really bad spot, what can I do? Feel free to give us a call and we can try to help walk you through it depending on what your specific situation is. And in general, also the best time to dispose of any nests is going to be during the winter when they're not in use the most. And that's going to be a similar thing for things like cleaning your chimney, because things like chimney swifts will want to nest in your chimney if it's uncovered. So during the winter, that's when you'll want to clean the chimney, as well as put a cap on your chimney if that doesn't exist already. And the last one I wanted to touch on, that basically if you haven't had an interaction with a wild animal that falls into those other categories, you may have had experiences with a nuisance animal. So basically an animal that's just getting on your nerves and doing some dastardly things that you're not very fond of. And in these cases, it is very much going to depend on what that specific situation is and what the species is as well. I put a little pathway on how to navigate our website because we have some really fantastic information on essentially managing these sort of conflicts depending on the species. So if you visit that web page that I gave that little navigation path to, then you can click on the species that you're dealing with and it will give you more specific advice. And if you still don't get that answer, call us, like I keep saying. That said, if the animal is clearly in distress or needs help, then definitely call us and get that animal into care. But please, like I've been saying before, don't relocate it. It's not the answer. There are lots of things you can do that aren't relocating the animal. And, one, if you can, just leave it alone, kind of with the nests, just wait it out. They'll be out of your hair in a little bit. But if you can't really leave it alone, you need to do something, then there are lots of species-specific deterrents that you can use that are typically going to focus on those sound and visual and sort of scent things. And each species is different, so that's another reason to visit our website. We can give you some specific examples depending on the animal. And if deterrents aren't working, basically to make the animal go away, then you can do things like exclusion, which, to put it simply, is just going to be sealing up possible entrances or building a barrier. So I know a very popular one is groundhogs or deer eating people's gardens. And really the best thing you can do in those cases, if deterrents aren't working, then basically build a fence around your garden. For deer, you're going to want it to be somewhere between 5 to 8 feet tall, and that way it's hopefully too tall for the deer to jump over, but even then they can sometimes get over them. It's just really, really tricky. And same thing for groundhogs, just basically building something where those animals can't get into the space that you're concerned about. It's going to be the same thing for your house. And of course, if the animal is inside your house, try to encourage it to leave without touching it with your bare hands, please, like I said, especially if it's an adult mammal or a rabies vector species. But also, that is why licensed wildlife removal companies exist, is because they do have the permits to take animals off properties if needed. But if nothing else, if you have a bat in your attic, they can get the bat out and get it back on its way, essentially. Just to finish out, I wanted to quickly go over some common myths that we hear about wildlife at the center. So one big one is people seeing a rabies vector species out during the day. That must mean it has rabies. No, unfortunately not. Just because you see one of these animals out during the day, a lot of people think this because they are typically more nocturnal, so it surprises people to see them active during the day. But there are a lot of other explanations for this behavior that aren't rabies related. So sometimes it's animals that are fattening up for the winter during the fall. Sometimes it's animals that have young that they're basically having to go out and find more resources because they need to feed their babies, little things like that. If you're really concerned about rabies, you're going to want to look for symptoms like lethargy, loss of balance, loss of fear of humans or other animals, if these animals are walking up to you or your pets or something, and just a general depressed mentation. If they just seem very sort of, then those can be indicators of rabies. But also distemper and rabies have a lot of similarities in terms of external symptoms. And like I said before, there's no way to confirm a case of rabies without testing that brain tissue. And rabies is so far less common than a lot of people really think it is. So if that is, you really truly think an animal has rabies, contact your sheriff's office or animal control, and they can handle the animal probably a little safer than you can. But just because you see an animal out during the day doesn't mean it has rabies. Another one that we hear a lot of, especially during the spring and summer, is if an animal isn't fully grown, then it must not be independent. And that is simply not true. Cottontails, for example, they're only about 4 inches long once they're independent. They are far smaller than an adult cottontail actually is, but they're perfectly independent. Similar thing for possums. They're about 8 inches from the tip of their nose to the base of their tail. And so these animals, they just kind of look like miniature versions of the adults. And a lot of people go, it's a baby, it's helpless. It is actually completely fine in most cases. Once they hit those sizes, they're completely independent. They just may be a little, sort of like I said before, young and dumb. So even if they don't seem like they're doing a great job, it doesn't mean that they're in distress and need veterinary care necessarily. And this really is going to depend on the species. So those are just a couple of examples. But once again, feel free to visit our website, and we have a lot more species-specific information like that. And if you're ever having any doubts, take a picture and send it to us or your local wildlife rehabilitator, and they can help you figure that out. Another myth is that touching a baby bird is going to cause its parents to abandon it. This advice, I think, was started as a way to deter people from touching baby animals when that wasn't necessary, but now so many people believe this that it actually makes people very reluctant to help baby birds when they do actually truly need help. And the big thing to remember here is that birds typically don't have a very strong sense of smell, so your human scent is not going to get on the bird. If it does, the parents probably aren't going to notice because they aren't super smellers like we are in that sense. And so your scent getting on the bird, that is not a problem. What is more likely to cause a parent to abandon their babies or abandon the nest is human disturbance or destruction of the nest. So as long as if there's a little nestling songbird that's on the ground, you can pick it up, and if you can find the nest, place it back in the nest, and that is actually perfectly fine, and very likely the parents will come back and care for that bird. It just kind of dropped out prematurely. Or if the nest got destroyed, but the parents are still nearby, you can construct a substitute nest, and we can help you figure out how exactly to do that if you go to our website or call us. So as long as the babies are reunited with the parents appropriately, then your scent being on them, kind of regardless of what species it is not actually something to be concerned about. But always, always, always call us and we can help you figure things out. Another one is birds that have hit windows. A lot of people think that, they're just a little stunned for a second, but if they fly off, then that means they're fine. Unfortunately, that is outdated advice at this point. What we have found and what a lot of studies have found over the years is that birds that have collided with windows usually end up getting internal or head trauma that isn't always fully apparent until about 48 hours after the collision. So basically, even if a bird hits a window, looks a little stunned for a minute, but then flies off, it very likely just passes away later in a different location. So really the best thing to do if you do ever find a bird that's clearly hit a window, or you hear it, see it hit that window, then you want to try and contain that bird as quickly as you can and get it to care as soon as possible. Because with some fluids and some anti-inflammatories in a veterinary setting, then that bird has a little bit of a higher chance of making it. But similarly, it's a little hard to tell within those first 48 hours. That said, if you go to contain a bird and it flies off, don't run into the woods after it. It's not. Just do your best, basically. Don't worry about hurting the bird trying to contain it either. Just really do your best. And if that bird can get into care, fantastic. It has a much greater chance. But if not, if it is just not feasible for you to get the bird, don't beat yourself up about it, please. And the last one that I have is, if you find an injured or orphaned animal, then you can give it food or water and then get it to a rehabilitator, or just take care of it yourself completely. This is the biggest thing that we hear from people at the center that is so just, we cannot encourage people to not do this enough. Because if you do not have training with wildlife, you're not going to be able to feed or water them properly. It ends up doing so much more harm than good, and it's not because people's intentions are bad. People's intentions doing this are always very, very good, very caring. They want to help, but it is hard for people to understand that they simply don't have the training and the expertise to do this properly. And especially if a wild animal is young and it is injured, it is very easy to either give it the wrong food or give it water, or, basically just feed it in a way that causes aspiration that can lead to pneumonia. And it is sad that a lot of the animals that we get at the center that have received care by members of the public, whether it was a single feeding or multiple weeks of care, they do end up passing away a good portion of the time because those actions previously just caused more issues than they really helped. So this is really just to say, if you find an animal that you're concerned about, contain it and get it to a professional as soon as possible. Don't give it food or water, because oftentimes that will end up doing more harm than good. But it is not that your intentions aren't in the right place. I've talked about all these things, and so you guys hopefully have some little tips on how to avoid certain conflicts in the future or handle them if they do come up. But what are some other ways that you can help? In my personal opinion, coming from the Wildlife Center, there is always supporting your local wildlife rehabilitator or wildlife hospital. And once again, there are a lot of different ways you can do that. We have a nice little page on ways that you can support us on our website that I put the little path there. You can sign up to be a volunteer if you want. So lots of different options. There's also keeping a wildlife rescue kit in your vehicle. So that way, if you're ever out and you come across an animal that needs help, you have all the supplies that you may need to actually contain and help that animal. And if you're feeling really gung-ho, you can become a wildlife rehabilitator, which is a whole separate topic that I definitely don't have time to get into today. But we do have a little article about that on our website, and you can also visit the Department of Wildlife Resources website, and they have the whole PDF that's, basically all the things you need to do to become a rehabilitator. And I will say now, it is not an easy process. Only do it if you are truly serious about it, because it's not a fun thing, but it really helps, it makes an impact. Since I mentioned the Wildlife Rescue Kit, I just wanted to provide a little list of supplies that are good to keep in there. So you're welcome to take a picture of this if you want. And yeah, just if you can, gather all those materials and keep something like this in your vehicle, then it's always very helpful. Always better to be prepared than not need it at all. And then lastly, just some last resources. So please always visit our website. We have so much information on there. And once again, depending on your situation, we have a specific page that talks about managing wildlife conflicts and basically how to improve a wildlife habitat if that's something you're interested in. We also have an email that you can contact us at if you ever have questions or concerns, and then of course our phone line. And we do have our front desk team at the center every single day between 9 to 5, and that's even on most holidays. So, in the future, even if you're having an animal crisis on 4th of July or something, then there will be somebody at the center ready to help you and ready to help that animal. Also, it doesn't really matter where you're calling us from, where you are in the state of Virginia, because we will ask you, where are you calling from in the state? And depending on where you are, we can pull up a list of rehabilitators that may be a little closer to you, so that way you don't have to drive the 45 minutes to Waynesboro if you don't need to. But also, if you want to look at what rehabilitators are near you yourself, then the Department of Wildlife Resources also has a page on that that's filtered by location, I believe. That is everything I have for you all, so thank you so much for listening.